Under President Jokowi, clearly the focus was on domestic issues, and he really did not take a leadership role on even regional issues, I would argue. So you mentioned that you expect President Prabowo to be much more outward looking. How do you think that will manifest?
Well, I think he's going to have to do a bit of calculation, right? You were right. I think there is a contrast between what we might have seen with respect to Jokowi's policy posture internationally versus that of Prabowo. I think Prabowo has this instinct to be more internationalist. I think he would like to, be able to communicate with the international community in a much more proactive manner. How will that be manifested? I think he will have to do some calculating with respect to a number of possibilities. The first one being whether Indonesia should join, for example, a grouping called the BRICS, right? I think it's no secret that Indonesia has been somewhat informally asked or invited. But I don't see Prabowo being in a position to jump on this very quickly. I think the calculation would have to involve, the extent to which such membership would bring about capital formation, whether or not, or the extent to which such membership would bring about divisiveness, right, with respect to perhaps the West or other parts of the world. So to the extent that his inclination is to try to internationalize the Indonesian narrative, he might have a different calculation with respect to a grouping called the BRICS. Secondly, what could potentially happen in the South China Sea. I think most countries in Southeast Asia have been hopeful, have been expecting a proactive role from Indonesia as to show leadership and taken on, any potential issue with respect to the South China Sea. That would be the second, I think, obvious possibility. The third possibility would be, how he's going to be able to basically trumpet, the need for Indonesia to basically embrace this energy transition narrative, right? Which I think will require massive amount of capital formation. Unfortunately or fortunately, the capital or economic capital sits within, or beyond Indonesia. So he needs to actually, much more proactively communicate with economic capital holders and economic capital allocators. Fortunately, many of those are actually within the G7 grouping and also China. So he will need to do a lot more communicating with, G7 countries and also China for purposes of putting forth this energy transition narrative, which could lead up to, the perfecting of the sustainability narrative, right? Which, in my calculation, would require at least $1 trillion for Indonesia to become a modern nation and to become, or to be sourcing its energy, to be metabolizing on a renewable basis. The technological capital could only be availed by countries like the US and Western European countries and other G7 countries, and also China. But it's still not affordable because the affordability for renewabilities is, typical of developing economies at a level of around 5 cents on a per kilowatt basis, whereas most of these renewables technologies could only be availed at a cost of 15 cents per kilowatt hour. So he's got to have to figure out a way to embrace this energy transition narrative in a very carefully crafted manner, so that we can try to attain carbon neutrality as quickly as 2050. But in my view, I think there is no realism with respect to not only Indonesia's, but many other developing economies' abilities to attain carbon neutrality by 2050. The last bit in terms of how, his effort could be manifested, would just be simply to play the role of sounding to everybody around the world, including the major powers of the United States, China, Russia, and the rest, so that there could be more peace and stability in other parts of the world. I see those 3 or 4 possibilities as the possible manifestations of what Prabowo could be doing.